as you might have seen on the program, it's called Environmental Investigative Reporting. And two things Mark really likes to do are traveling, going around the world, and caring about the environment. And maybe you ask yourself if this is actually possible or not. And probably you can answer it with yes and no. But Mark did a really long journey of experiencing what the cost of it is actually. And if you want to have it in more detail, it's right here in his current book, The Carbon Shock, where he actually brings together the different areas of not only environment, but also politics and economics and how they belong together. And speaking of these different areas, I don't know, like, to which extent you've done environmental journalism so far, but it's actually not the most popular beat in journalism because it's really difficult because there's a lot of lobbyism around it also. And Mark tries, and I think he does it really nicely, to put all these different areas together. And before he wrote this book, he's been also working as a journalist for different US media like Harper's, The Nation, Mother Jones, and he was also a correspondent for a PBS News magazine. And another reason why he's here and where he has worked for a long, long time was the Center of Investigative Reporting, which he's also going to give a brief introduction in a minute. And right now he's teaching at the journalism school in Berkeley in California. So just to give you a short overview of how we're going to do this session, Mark will shortly describe a bit, because I don't know if you're all familiar with it, about the Center of Investigative Reporting. And then he will tell us some personal experiences, like what he thinks is really important during the research regarding environmental journalism. And he will also do this a bit like pass pro toto with the book, because he has really nice examples how you can do this and go along with it, and what the barriers are, the problems you might face. And then we will open it up to a Q&A. We both think it's always really good, like you have maybe some really detailed and concrete questions where Mark can help with the research methods regarding this topic. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be introduced by such an eloquent journalist. I'm very happy to be here in Hamburg. I've actually had the pleasure of being here for about a couple of weeks now, actually, at the University of Hamburg. They have this amazing CLISAP program, which I think is actually very interesting for a journalist, because they bring together natural scientists studying the climate, of course, social scientists, which are studying the kind of phenomenon sociologically, and journalists, which is, of course, what I am. And I actually think that it's of particular, and I think it's a fairly rare program here in Hamburg. I think what's interesting about environmental journalism and what's interesting about climate reporting, which is what I've been doing the last couple of years, is how it brings together all the disciplines that we need to understand. So I think that's certainly what makes it very interesting. And I've found that you follow one thread of scientific evidence, and you end up in the entire kind of socioeconomic, geopolitical system. And that's what I like to do when I do environmental reporting, is follow the science into the points at which it collides with the basic ways that the interests are organized in the society. And so when you think of doing environmental journalism, it's not just simply scientific discovery or a new environmental hazard here or there. It's actually following that evidence, understanding the science until it gets you into the fundamental economic, political structures of our time. And that's why environmental journalism is both so important, but it's also interesting, which of course you want to find something interesting to do, because environmental journalism gets you into the fundamental economic and social considerations of the society all around us. So that's, I would just, as an introductory concept, that's why that's, I think, a way to understand it and a way to think about doing environmental journalism. I've been doing this work for 2, maybe even 3 decades, really on an environmental path, and I started actually on my first book, which was some years ago now, which was an expose of how pesticides that were banned in the United States, this is where I'm from, are exported to developing countries. And I was in my 20s, and I was learning from some masters of investigative reporting. And what I realized was we did a book and a bunch of magazine articles that exposed essentially how pesticides that were banned in the United States were exported to developing countries, including Guatemala, Honduras, Philippines, etc. And then the fruits and vegetables where the pesticides were applied were returned back to the United States on the residues, which is why the book was called Circle of Poison. And in terms of how you approach environmental journalism, this was an eye-opening thing to realize that basically you followed a story, one particularly explosive story, the notion of banning a deeply immoral practice, banning pesticides in one country and then exporting them to another. And you realize that it was not just the particular phenomenon that you were describing, but that brought you deep into the kind of way that geopolitics was organized and where the interests were in that. And that was an eye-opening experience for me, and I've tried to do that ever since. So my subsequent work, just to get us up to date, because I think this all builds on that essential point, is a body of work. When I talk about doing stories, and I think it's a good idea for journalists to think like this, is you come up with a book, but we're all doing stories at the same time. So the great thing is, I did a whole bunch of stories that led to this book, but my previous book, I just want to point out, because I'm not here just to talk about books, but about the reporting process. And my previous book was actually called Exposed. And all the books I do, which actually have these very long subtitles, and the subtitle is where you actually understand how the kind of environment leads you to much bigger questions. And the subtitle of my last book was called Exposed, and it was called The Toxic Chemistry of Everyday Products and What's at Stake for American Power. Because actually, and here we are in Europe, of course, and that book was essentially how the consolidation of the European Union as a unified economic force, which I don't have to tell you about, in 2005, that began with the Maastricht, the consolidation of the EU, led to the European Union being the world's largest market. Why does that matter? That sounds like a very boring, though interesting fact. But actually, when you follow the trail from the fact of the EU becoming the world's largest market, which it did in 2005, it became much larger than the United States, has enormous impact in the environmental realm, because suddenly you had these measures being pursued in Europe to go after toxic chemicals in everything from cosmetics to consumer products, substances that are considered dangerous, toxic chemicals of various sorts, which were for the first time being regulated in the European Union, which until that moment had been following the American model of regulating toxic chemicals. Starting in 2005, 2006, 2007, you had this initiative called REACH, which for those of you who know about it probably think it's very boring and it's a very technical European directive. In fact, this approach of the European Union to toxic chemicals has had enormous impact around the world, and I was able to document essentially in my last book and in a whole bunch of magazine articles and in a documentary how products that are banned in the European Union were basically exported to the United States. So we became the developing world according to that model. And that was a very new way to actually understand the geopolitical implications of environmental stories. Yes.
Actually, maybe right there, whilst you were doing this research, because as you described, there was a relation there between the European Union and the US, and also, of course, some businesses were involved. Did you face any challenges whilst you did this research? Were there any?
Yeah. So I wanted to make 2 points about the methodology question, which will answer that question, because my next book and body of reporting, I could say, was called is on the economic impacts of climate change, and this book, which is called Carbon Shock, it's right here, is tales from around the world of different places and situations where the costs of fossil fuels are being experienced, but are largely hidden by the way the economic system is organized now. So one of the things you want to do as a journalist, of course, is to challenge the existing paradigmatic understanding of the way the world is. I mean, this is what journalists dream of. It's certainly what I dream of changing fundamental understanding of how people grasp the world. And in this case, this book began with this notion of how so many of the environmental costs of fossil fuels have been hidden by the current economic system. So you, the society, we bear the enormous financial consequences of climate change in the shifting planet that we live on, from the drought to the heat waves to the flood control measures that you have to do in measures all across the world. But many of those costs are hidden in the economic system. And so there are 2 points I want to make to Katerina's point. Number one is you have facts that are hidden, and you have facts which actually take some real work to actually obtain and extract. And then you have facts that are actually hiding in plain sight, right? And so I would distinguish between these two themes. When it comes to climate change, for example, you have a whole sequence of facts that are actually hiding all around us in plain sight. And it's a question of actually coming up with the right question to know what you're looking for. So once you begin to ask the question of what are the hidden costs of climate change, you don't actually have to go do a Freedom of Information Act request. You don't have to get a leaked document to figure out what that is. You just have to know who to talk to and what to listen to. So who is it? So how do you start the process of identifying this process of where how the fossil fuel companies have this enormous built-in advantage economically in the way that the society is organized today? And in that case, you have all these facts hidden in plain sight, which includes, for example, by asking the question, you determine your course of reporting. In this case, of course, I went to insurance companies who are, I don't have to tell you, are going to start telling you where the actual costs are, because they have to pay the price when all this devastation happens. So you have insurance companies are very important sources when it comes to actually understanding the costs and putting the costs that are being apportioned by insurance companies against the costs that are being declared by companies, and you begin to get a much more of a complete picture. Other cases, you have facts that are largely hidden. So in the case of the toxic chemical industry, and here we are at this international conference, I want to point out how deeply important this ability to think internationally is. So when you have, for example, you have transnational companies that operate both in the United States and in the European Union. This is a sort of a global economy. So how do we make the global economy work for us as journalists? Well, if you can begin to think sort of globally in a global context, you can begin to realize that there's all sorts of information you can get about American companies in Europe, because they have to register here according to a whole different set of criteria than they do in the United States. You can find out about the toxicity of the chemicals they sell in the United States. You can find out in Europe. And the reverse is also true, where companies, which are European companies operating in the United States, you can get information about them from American governmental and NGO sources that you can't get from Europe. And it's the ability to put those two together that enables you to create a kind of a truly global picture. And that's what I wanted. That's what I try to do in Carbon Shock. In doing this book, Carbon Shock, I was actually very interested in the lack of accountability of fossil fuel companies for the damages that they cause. That is the fundamental issue of climate change. That's what the negotiations are all about. It's actually trying to find a price for carbon. It's trying to find a price for carbon that reflects its actual cost to society. When we say society, we're saying you and me, people who pay taxes to our government, have to pay the cost for the enormous costs of fossil fuel damage. And in doing so, I actually, the interest in that particular topic was about how do you actually identify this question of shielding major companies from accountability. And in doing that, I actually found in asking that question, I found an example right here in Europe, about 1,000 kilometers from here, which was about 10 years ago, in the midst of a violent Atlantic storm in the North Atlantic, an oil tanker sank. And some of you might remember this oil tanker. It was called the Prestige. I don't know if people remember the sinking of the oil tanker called the Prestige. Anybody remember the Prestige? Yeah, devastating. One of the worst environmental disasters in Europe. I probably don't have to tell you. And what was interesting to me at that time was to figure out who ultimately was responsible for the massive damage that the Prestige oil tanker caused to 1,000 kilometers of coastline in France and Spain, and a little bit into France. And the marine ecology was devastated. The economy was wiped out. There was no tourism. And the question was, who is responsible? And what I discovered in the course of investigating that case was that no one who had responsibility for that particular ship that actually broke apart off the coast of Spain. Some of you might remember some of those incredible pictures where the oil just came washing onto the coastline of Spain and caused massive, it was one of the worst environmental catastrophes in European history. And not a single solitary person has been held accountable. Why? You had the oil tanker that was carrying Russian oil, remember, left from St. Petersburg, passed right along here, along the between the German and Danish coast, broke apart in the Spanish water, sent massive quantities of oil onto the shore. The ship was flying the flag of the Bahamas. Where was it registered? It was registered in the thriving metropolis of, I'm sure you've all been there before, Monrovia, Liberia. So one of the most sophisticated government authorities, which is now the home of at least 2/3 of the oil tankers that are on the oil on the oceans today. And I went to that beach to actually explore the question of liability when it came to that damage. And I looked out in the beaches in every direction, and I saw this kind of massive damage. I saw the oil splattering the rocks to the north towards Ireland, and the oil, just endless oil on rocks, all the way down to Africa. And I was so moved by this experience of just feeling like I was smelling a gasoline station in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean that I picked up, I never wanted to forget that feeling of destruction. And I picked up a rock from the beach, which is splattered with the oil, the Prestige, and I've been carrying this rock with me now for many years since that time as a reminder to understand what environmental damage means. So right here is the physical evidence of the Prestige, if you ever need it again, coated with oil. And the reason that I mention this is because the story of this rock is very much like the unpacking of the story around climate change. Because the people who created the damage to this rock that actually created the oil that is now coating this rock have actually have escaped all questions of liability for that case. And there's an amazing stories about how they did that, which I write about in the book, the effort to escape liability. So, which include, by the way, the fact that for those who remember this disaster, the captain of the ship who had been on board the ship before it sank had actually complained about the condition of the ship before it set sail from Russia, and said it was the worst ship he'd ever seen in 25 years of being a ship captain, and was fired by the Greek owners of the ship and replaced with this guy named Apostolos Mangouras, who some people might remember was ultimately the captain who was captaining the ship when it sank for reasons that had been precisely identified by the captain, who himself was fired. And so out the ship went, sank for exactly the same the reasons that had been predicted by the captain who was fired, and the owners of the ship, very much like the situation with climate change, were able to dodge behind the multiple trapdoors of the legal and economic system that protected them. They couldn't get any money out of the asset because it was registered in Liberia. There was no accountability because it was a Bahamas flag, and the Bahamas has no authority to regulate these enforcements, and all the way down the line. The interesting thing about, in terms of reporting that story, was this notion of the accountability question. I was able to take, for example, the European Parliament was actually very concerned about this case because you'd actually gone through the Erika disaster 5 years previously, and had actually investigated the American company that was ostensibly the inspector of the Prestige ship. So by taking the European investigation and applying that to the Prestige, I was able to actually understand really precisely how this company had escaped liability. So when you think about,
I just wanted to ask, and I'm sorry for interrupting, I think it's a very, very interesting case, but maybe afterwards, do we also speak a bit about like general resources or methods, because this is actually how it's in the table.
Yes.
So maybe like who do you cooperate with if you do stories like this? What kind of resources do you use? I mean, it's a really interesting case story, but it's one specific example.
Yes. So, I mean, how do you go about starting a environmental investigation? I mean, there are so many kind of when it comes to environmental investigations, I think the very first step is to actually understand the science. So, the science is interesting for a number of different reasons. Number one, you have to get a command of the science in order to actually know what it is you're writing about. But there's another thing that's actually in scientific journals, and if you are an environmental journalist, I encourage you to get some familiarity with scientific journals, because one of the interesting things about scientific findings is if you see science as a continual evolution of ideas and understanding about the natural world, the world that we live in, every one of those new scientific discoveries presents a conflict, right? So every single science story you read has an implied conflict within it. Whether you're reading toxicochemical studies, you're reading kind of sociological studies, whatever it is, it's a challenge to the existing order. And one of the jobs, I think, of an environmental journalist is to actually read science with an eye on the conflict embedded in the study. So I read a lot of.
Are there some magazines you would especially recommend?
What's that? Yeah. I would, if you're doing climate change, the Journal of Atmospheric Studies is a very good one. The Science magazine, very important when it comes to general science. If you're doing toxic chemical research, there's a publication called Mortality and Morbidity, which is about death and sickness and dying, which is a very important journal. You seem to know that one?
No, I just agree that dying is kind of an important topic.
Yeah. You can't really avoid it. Yeah.
But actually, other than also magazines, because I think the example you said with the Prestige, it's really obvious. You have a disaster, and then you can see and follow the route, like who to talk to. But you said, of course, like it's always important who to talk to. And before you spoke about the hidden thing, and I think this is really something, especially with like dealing with environmental topics, and I totally agree. Like you need the science, but there's a lot of science research material, maybe on top of or additionally to the magazines. Where do you look for? Like, who do you ask, and how do you, because you have, as you said, like a three-decade experience with that. Like, where do you go? What were your experience? Where it's good to look for an answer to all these hidden facts?
Well, first you want to talk to the scientists, which is important. Everybody should be willing to get on the phone and just talk to a scientist, because often they can steer you in the right direction. Then, for example, if you find out that there is a particular substance when it comes to an environmental toxin, let's say it's a toxic question. Number one, you want to understand what that is. Then your next question is, who basically touches, who has the slightest thing to do with this particular substance? So basically, I remember in some of the work that I've done on toxics, grappling with I tried to observe. You want to know where these substances are being shipped to, right? So how do you go about identifying that? Well, you could stand outside the company and follow a truck, which isn't really very practical. But I remember trying to think this through, and of course you have you need to start thinking out of the box. I mean, in a way, you want to talk to some of the key sources on at least the shipment and the movement of toxic substances turns out to be the departments of transportation, the ministries of transport that actually have to register trucks, and things that move goods from one place to another have to be registered with a particular authority, particularly here in a sophisticated place like Germany. And so what you want is a whole strategy for, I mean, you have obvious issues of the NGO community. When dealing with NGOs, I always find it's very important to to actually find out who their sources are, like who are there. You've got a million NGOs here in Europe and in Germany, and one of the early stages I would suggest is actually not only getting familiar with what the NGOs are saying, because obviously it's legitimate and very important, but actually find out who they've been talking to, find out who their sources are. And in doing this book and various other reporting, all those things always list sources at the bottom, or the good ones anyway, the reliable ones, list sources at the bottom of their reports that you can access to. Don't just take the report at face value. Find out who they base their findings on.
We had two questions here, so I don't know. Ladies first.
Okay, so you kind of described that it's, or at least it seems like that it's very easy to talk to the scientists and get kind of a consensus out of it, and you start from there. But me reporting, as being a science reporter, I know that this is kind of hard, because even with this REACH agreement, that of course is a great thing that's happening in the European Union, there is not a whole lot of consensus. Some scientists say it's much more dangerous than what the guys say from REACH. Others say like they overestimate the toxicity of certain things. So, and the same is true, I think, for climate scientists. You say, okay, you just talk to the insurance company and ask them, okay, what's kind of the amount of money they are kind of insuring? But a lot of scientists are saying the amount of money is also going up or through the roof, because we're building much more buildings closer to the coast. So it's actually not climate change that is getting more severe. It's not only this factor, but you have a lot of factors, and that's kind of what I see a lot of times as a science reporter. You go out there, have a simple thesis, and you find out that there are much more factors in play why things happen the way they happen. And that's kind of the question. How do you kind of stay true, and on the other side, do not get too complicated for the reader to understand that?
Then write about those complications. I mean, I think that's actually really important. There's this kind of common assumption that climate change is leading to all this increased sea level, increased damages along the coast, and so you are sitting on a very good story by introducing this complication into this basic presumption that people have. So I think actually one of the things that people tend to assume is like I think a journalist's credibility is enhanced by introducing complexity in questions. So actually, even if there is some lack of perfect consensus around the science, that should be in your story, because that will enhance your credibility as a journalist reporting on what the kind of basic understanding of is at this point, but introducing the levels of complexity and uncertainty and risk that are involved in the calculations will enhance your credibility as a journalist and your ability to continue writing. So, for example, I just heard this interesting analysis kind of along this point that that actually insurance companies may be using climate change to raise their rates, even if the actual contributing factors to the higher risks are not related to climate change. Climate change may be providing a very good cover for insurance increasing, which is kind of interesting. So, in other words, your job is not to promote one position or another when it comes to, yeah. So, I think.
Okay, yeah, probably that answers the question, but like sometimes the consensus is so far away that some would say, okay, it is a story, it is dangerous, we have to like avoid, for instance, shipping those pesticides, and others would say like, no, I mean like be too cautious about it and actually we're helping others, which is of course a different view, but like, so I think in some cases, if you project all what is in there in science, then in some cases the whole story dies within, because some scientists will say it's not a problem at all.
Yeah, but yes, sir. Yeah.
I think my question is going kind of like in the same direction. So like what I experience within my research is that scientists are having so different opinions that, I mean, like you can evaluate them, you can put them in context, but they're going so far that it's quite difficult for an outsider to evaluate them and to find like a final opinion. And my question was actually, how do you include other factors within your research, such as politics, cultural context, etc., in order to make up your mind about like the science which is involved in like, the conclusions you make?
Well, that's a great question. First of all, one if you can find somebody who you trust, I do want, in terms of your methodology, who can help you navigate. You know, somebody who actually whose motives you kind of understand, and who can actually help you explain certain things, test your hypothesis. You know, you have your hypothesis, you want to test your hypothesis. Have what I like to call it kind of a navigator, somebody you can check with if you have somebody that's in that position. I would do is extrapolate out as to the interests on whatever side it is that you're talking about. That's where you get into this interesting realm where the scientific findings will have an impact. If it's interpreted this way, it will impact that interest. If it's interpreted this way, it will impact this interest. And you explaining how the interests are linked to the scientific, if you want to call it dispute, or the scientific findings, will actually be a way to journalistically handle the story. So if you go like, well, it's the broad understanding is, which provides a direct threat to this industry that does X, Y, Z. But there are other, ways to understand this, which, if true, would actually benefit this.
So you could even like have assumptions without like finding like eventually hidden facts.
Yes.
So you're building up assumptions between like the insurance company, for example, like the science, like political movements, etc. And in that way you can kind of like find conclusions.
Yeah, I don't think you have to assume that there's certainty when it comes to,
Yeah, I think maybe it's also the extent of displaying and drawing a conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
So, but maybe you can, explain us how you do this, because I think we had this like a lot of different scientific point of views, and then the people who interpreted it. Mm-hmm. So that would only be like displaying what, of course, journalists also do. They say, okay, look, those guys say this, the other guys say this, and there's like research material about this. But then, of course, it's also understood that as a journalist, you are kind of supposed to also draw a conclusion. So maybe this is like the tricky part, like how do you do this?
I think we have to understand that, like, science is, in a way, this is interesting. It's becoming a discussion really about science, about reporting on science, which environmental reporting is, basically. And, but I think that science is inherently uncertain, right? And sometimes we play it as if it's more certain than it actually is. And that does a disservice to the science, and it does a disservice to journalism to actually pretend that science is that certain. And so the only thing you have as a journalist is your credibility, right? So you, I think, introducing the fact that there may be questions about the science or questions about the conclusions of these particular scientific developments can be a very effective way to basically maintain your credibility in the face of this kind of uncertainty. And so, for example, I wrote about in this book the impact of the contribution that climate change is making to the drought in California, which is significant. And the drought in California is creating massive alterations of the way people grow crops. So food is going up. Number one, the quality of certain foods are dropping in California because of the incredible changes in the temperature, right? So cherries and particularly tree crops and such like that. So, which is related to the fact that they can't get water and it's getting too hot. So this is a phenomenon that is both contributed to by climate change, but it's also contributed to by the kind of crazy way that they've set up the water system in California. And by combining those elements, you end up with a much more potent story than about one particular thing. So the in terms of like methodology, you I feel like so many of the things are fairly. I mean, I spent a lot of time, trying to figure out what the International Energy Agency is saying, or different international bodies, the World Health Organization, in California, what the Department of Water Resources is doing. You need to kind of like, I think it's what's very effective is to figure out the point you want to make and figure out ways to illustrate that point. So
yeah, maybe because I think like this is not leading anywhere. We make it a cut because you're also here as you have been working for the Center of Investigative Reporting, and I think there was this urge for like practical recommendations from your work. So I don't know, maybe you can tell us a bit of the work they do, and maybe also because I think especially if you're working as an investigative journalist, the network, and as you said, you spoke about navigators, like it's important maybe to collaborate.
Yeah.
So maybe you can tell us what the Center of Investigative Reporting does and to which extent that it might be interesting for the people here in the room, or maybe doing something similar somewhere else.
Well, the Center for Investigative Reporting was founded in 1977, a long time ago, when they realized that basically there was very few that investigative reporting could not be supported by traditional market forces in the media, and which I'm sure you're familiar with here in Germany. So a couple of people from Rolling Stone magazine who were doing investigative journalism for Rolling Stone and were living in San Francisco when Jan Wenner decided to move Rolling Stone to New York, basically decided they would stick around and try to do investigative journalism. So they raised money from foundations. It's now been going for about 35, 40 years, and it's the oldest group in the country, possibly in the world. And the model is that they go and raise money from foundations and wealthy individuals who believe that investigative reporting is an important part of a democratic society. And now actually have gone through, they used to do major documentaries with Frontline, the PBS Frontline, There's a big television documentary show on public television. Major magazine stories that would be supported by foundations. Now the organization is doing a lot of radio, and there's a show, you can hear it on the web. It's a podcast called Reveal, Reveal. And I think as a model, they have actually provided the model for ICIJ, which is now here, Center for Public Integrity. I mean, each of them are doing different kinds of work. But there was, and even here, the European Fund for Investigative Reporting got some ideas. I think what you need is what's key is actually the ability of wealthy foundations. I don't know if you have that in Germany, wealthy foundations to give money to journalism organizations. Here you get money, I think some journalism groups get money from the government or the government of the EU or, I know.
Well, there are actually also always like popping up some collaborations here in Germany or in Europe. So this why I ask, like, would be interesting to which extent there's a collaboration possible, or for example, if someone has like an interesting research to do, like what are the steps to collaborate with the Center of Investigative Reporting, or how do they work? Maybe there's some really positive examples people here from similar groups can learn from.
Actually, the level of collaboration that's happening here is really incredible for me to see. And in the 80s, I was based in Paris, and I created this little mini network of international investigative reporters to kind of collaborate on stories. Now we're finding this incredible sense of collaboration. I think what's interesting about the whole phenomena of collaboration is just how people are working on common tales. Stories fall across borders. The idea that you can collaborate between two different national markets, 3 different, 4 different, 5 different, 6 different, is really an extraordinary development. The center involves some. There are some kind of they don't collaborate on the level that ICIJ collaborates with stories, although they're doing some work with the African Center of Investigative Reporting. And if you're interested in, I don't know if people are familiar with the Center for Investigative Reporting. It specializes in it had specialized in long-form investigative reporting. Now they're doing shorter. It's based in Berkeley, California, right near Berkeley, California. And they essentially went from doing more international investigations to doing more national investigations, with some exceptions. So if you're at all, if you're interested in connecting with them, I can introduce you to people who are there. There's no formal way to connect with the center, right? But they, and it's actually quite different from the way that ICIJ works.
But as you have been working with them for a while, maybe it's really, I don't know if it's possible, but maybe you can just kind of step by step explain how you, for example, if there's an investigative research, like how you would proceed with it, like really practical.
So, practically speaking. All right. So a few years ago, I became aware that there was this phenomenon in the world where forests in the Amazon were getting, you had basically scouts coming from the major industrial polluting companies in the world, in Europe and the United States, who were sending people down to the Amazon to actually figure out huge plots of land and trees where they could basically do a deal with local Brazilian authorities or other authorities or tribes to purchase a whole new concept in the world that had never existed before, which is the rights to the carbon, to the CO2 in trees. As you probably know, CO2 is embedded in trees, right? Trees breathe in CO2 and breathe out oxygen. That's why we're here. And we breathe out CO2 and breathe in oxygen, which is why trees are there. So we have this partnership. And of course, CO2 is one of the leading greenhouse gases in the world, as you know. So the question was, and this is I was doing when I was at CIR, just to start from actually nowhere to an investigation. You start with a question. The question is, if companies are beginning to, and I'm sure maybe you're familiar with this, that they were buying the rights to trees in the Amazon, agreeing not to cut them down, and then saying that they were offsetting their emissions back here, right? Same thing, German companies did it as did American companies. And they would say like, well, that little plot of land in Brazil, we're not cutting those trees down. So because we're not cutting those trees down, and the CO2 will stay in those trees rather than being cut down, we will then claim that that is an offset to our emissions, right? So that was a fact. That was basically what that was being done. The question is, how do you get going on an investigation into that question? We did a kind of a long investigation into this question, because the first question really that begins every environmental investigation is how do you actually turn trees in a foreign country into a commodity? This is like a big question. And but I didn't know the answer to that question. Nobody else that I talked to or anybody I knew did. So you begin systematically, if we talk about like how to go about an investigation, figure out one, you talk to people who know about trees, which is, helpful. And you talk to people who know that part of, in this case, Brazil. You find somebody who's familiar with the topic, and you go through every step of the way to actually understand. In this case, there was somebody who was in this part of Brazil who was traveling through an offset that had been bought by General Motors, which is a big American car company. And I would get on Skype once a week, basically when she got near an internet, to ask her what the scene was like. Because sometimes you can get the scene of a place. This is like in terms of how you go about these stories without actually being there, of course, until hopefully you can then raise money to actually get somewhere.
You had a question there?
Actually, it's a different topic, so maybe you want to finish your point and then I'll ask the question.
I just wanted to finish this point that essentially, one, figure out what it is that's going on. In this case, talk to tree scientists, like what is it about this CO2 sequestration. Two, find people who've been to a place or are experiencing whatever it is. In this case, it was somebody who knew that part of Brazil. And three, work out the mechanisms by which the issuance of offsets is regulated, right, which turns out to be by the United Nations, and talk to the people who have written about this. You do an internet search, you figure out who's written about it, both in scientific journals and the popular press, and you talk to them, and you put step by step by step, you put your evidence together. I guess I haven't gone into all the different steps because I assume you basically know the basic steps of determining who you talk to is based on the question you're asking. And there are innumerable. What we can do, number one, with Skype now is amazing because you can talk to anybody in the world with Skype. There are international, yeah. So anyway, what's your?
My question is about the structural issues of these investigations, because I think like investigating an environmental project is a very lengthy procedure. So it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of money, it takes probably more than one person to do it. How do you see the possibilities to finance this, like push it through in an editing desk to go for this topic, and also to finance it for freelancers who often pursue these kind of topics?
Well, I think freelancers, yes, I understand. Number one, I guess there are two parts of that question. Find the way to turn it into a story, which means get yourself a scene, find yourself a place from which you can tell the story, get as much detail as you can about the place. You don't have to be there to initially get that detail. You can actually recreate meetings, you can recreate settings, you can create by talking to people on the phone, get them on the phone to describe things as if you're there. And there are many ways to actually create the sense of being there without obviously not being there. So that's one in terms of presenting it to your editor. Create the stakes, and the stakes come from the sort of human impacts, of course, on the ground, which you get from basically reading enough of the science to understand what the implications are, and reading. I find it very interesting to read reports in the local press from wherever you're talking about. I mean, I'm talking most of the time you're talking about a place that's not your own hometown. Read the local newspaper, which now you can do on the web. You used to never be able to do that. You can read the local newspaper, find specialty publications that deal with this particular question. There are all sorts. There are specialty publications about everything now, and I think that those are very useful. You know what I mean by specialty trade publications that represent the pharmaceutical industry, or that represent the carbon auditing associations, or whatever they might be. Yeah, and
Sorry, I didn't want to.
yeah, and so one would be to create a sense of where of the place and the circumstance and the people involved, and two is consider where the fund. Yes. Funding is not, I'm very aware of this effort. I had to get foundation funding to finish this book. So you basically need to think of where the funding sources are. I happen to know here in Europe, Nils is here, he knows a lot about the European Fund for Investigative Journalism, which is based in Brussels. And yeah, do you want to say a word about that just quickly, just so they know? I mean, this is a great organization that funds transnational European.
It's easy to approach project, and if you have a project, you should have something very specific you want to investigate. You should not just want to have quotes for a story, and you should. So it's pretty much what investigative reporting is about. It is to investigate something new. You should not copy an investigation somebody else has been doing. And you should do it cross-border and not as a specific German project. And when you do it cross-border, you should work with somebody in that country, not thinking you can do the research in other countries. So it's a way to try to lift the level of international journalistic cooperation.
So I would just go to their website, which is, I think, European Fund for Investigative Journalism.
She's also
Yeah.
speaking about
So,
it. And I know about all this because I was in the first jury deciding which project we actually want to support and which we don't.
So you could talk to Niels Gunnar Nielsen over here from Denmark, who knows a lot more. But they do some very substantial work in terms of funding. And I don't know what the sources are in Germany. I'm sure you probably know more than I do, but it's tricky. I do think the framing of the story is very important at the early stage, so actually you can get an editor behind you and then try to get some funding. Yeah.
Mark, can I say one thing more inspired by what you're saying about this is another area where it actually is not so many different sources you need to discover. You need to just find a way where you can get the answers. It's actually also count for data in this area, which are rather important. That getting data on the environment is much more easy compared to getting data in any other area we cover as journalists. And Mark comes from a tradition in the US where it normally has a lot of easy access to data, but especially in Europe, there has been a change where there is an act to environmental information which has been turned into an EU directive, which means that we have a defined much more access to environmental information. And I have used this in Denmark to run a lot of cases to get data on the height of every square meter below above sea level. And I won the case in the end. And I'm also on all hazardous production in Denmark. The and in the end I got the data using precisely this environmental act, and it has also been used to get the data on farm subsidies and on pesticide use and on antibiotics. So it's not easy, but we have developed a situation in Denmark where we actually win the cases when we use this regulation. And it changes also because this is also part of science. So they have a way of sharing much more, and if they don't share, we beat them and we win and we get the data. So that's part of the story. That
Yes.
That it's much easier in this area compared to all other areas, and especially in Germany.
And you
come
could.
from a tradition where data is hidden by the authority, but especially environmental data they can't hide. So just start asking for these data.
And just to add quickly, and then I go to there, and I'm just reiterating what you might already know, but there is an amazing organization in Brussels that actually helps with Freedom of Information Act requests, and there is this kind of EU-wide ability to obtain information through a Freedom of Information Act request. And I don't know if some of you have tried doing that already. I'm sure you have one in Germany, but there's a group that can really help you both for obtaining information from within the EU, as well as individual nations, each of which have their own FOIA. But it's called wobbing. For those of you who know Flemish, you'll know what it means. It means prying open in Flemish. But it's wobbing.eu. And they have great information on the FOIA. Yeah.
So maybe because the time is running out, you have the last question.
I just wanted to ask, so as you pointed out earlier, I think it's also quite true that like for most environmental issues, it's good to speak with the scientists first. Because normally, for example, if you have environmental activists or NGOs, they might lean to the one side. Of course, if you talk with corporations on the other side, they might lean to the other side. But on the other hand, of course, we have to acknowledge that also scientists are not always completely objective. So, for example, let's say we talk about the topic of nuclear energy. It's a very controversial topic in Germany. If you talk to NGOs, activists, they might over-dramatize it. If you talk to the energy companies doing it, they might downplay it. So we turn to scientists for information. What kind of hints would you be looking for to evaluate whether a scientist to you seems mostly independent, so kind of subjective, or whether a scientist might be the one or the other side?
Oh, that's, yeah.
What would you be looking for?
Yeah. I would ask them, what has the criticism been of your work? Which is interesting because you shouldn't expect that to get a full answer from that question. But a scientist who's actually being honest will actually say, well, some people raised this question in this journal or that journal, whereas a scientist who is closed-minded and has this, if you want to call it an agenda, will probably not be very honest with you about the criticism of their work. And I think that's actually a good question to ask. That is actually, because you can get a feel for what their response is. If they tell you that nobody criticizes my work, this is there's a problem. That would be, I think, one thing. And of course, read yourself to find out what the disputes might have been about the work in other journals and stuff. But I think that's a good way once you get them on the phone. And if they are very resistant
To admit it.
yes, then you know that there's some other agenda going on. Yeah, and
I think there was a really nice practical thing at the end. I don't know if you have any more questions, you can still come to Mark. And other than that, I wish you a nice evening and thank you, Mark.
Okay, thank you.